The night was quiet, almost eerily so, as Thomas sat in his living room with a cup of tea cradled between his hands. The street outside his house was empty, bathed in the soft glow of the occasional street lamp. He was just beginning to unwind after a long day at work when a sudden, sharp sound broke the silence. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. It started as a faint whimper but grew louder, tugging at his attention. Thomas's brows furrowed, and he set his cup down, straining to listen. Was it an animal? The sound came again, more insistent this time, a high-pitched, desperate cry that made his chest tighten with unease. He stood up, moving cautiously to the front window. The cold glass pressed against his forehead as he peered outside, scanning the dimly lit street. The street lamp cast long, wavering shadows, and Thomas squinted, trying to see where the noise was coming from. At first, he saw nothing but the empty pavement and the gentle rustling of the trees in the breeze. But then, just under the warm pool of light from the street lamp, a small, shivering shape caught his eye. It was a puppy, thin and scruffy, its fur sticking up in odd patches. The little creature was trembling, and its cries pierced the night air, sounding more urgent with each whine. Thomas felt a pang of concern and confusion. Why was a puppy out here alone at this hour? He glanced at the clock on the wall. It was nearly midnight. He debated whether to step outside. It was late, and the neighborhood was known for being quiet, with most people already tucked into bed. But the persistent cries gnawed at him, urging him to act. The puppy let out another desperate sound, and Thomas made up his mind. He grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair, slipped it on, and walked to the front door. The cold metal of the doorknob felt harsh against his skin as he turned it and stepped outside. The cool night air hit him, sending a shiver down his spine, but he ignored it and took a few cautious steps toward the puppy. The little dog noticed him immediately, its large, dark eyes reflecting the light with an almost pleading expression. It barked, a short, sharp sound, before letting out another whine that seemed to resonate with a deeper sense of urgency. Thomas's heart clenched, and he lowered himself onto one knee, extending a hand slowly. "Hey, buddy," he said softly, trying not to startle it. "What's going on? Why are you out here all alone?" The puppy's ears twitched, and for a moment, it seemed to consider his approach. But then, as if remembering something important, it jumped to its feet, took a few steps back, and barked again. This time, the bark was sharper, almost as if it were trying to communicate something more urgent. Thomas frowned, a wave of unease washing over him. The puppy wasn't just lost or hungry, it was trying to tell him something. Thomas stood up and glanced down the street, wondering if someone else might hear the noise and come outside. But every house was dark, curtains drawn tightly shut. He turned his attention back to the puppy, whose eyes were fixed on him. It barked again and began to move, stopping a few feet away and turning its head as if beckoning him to follow. The urgency in the puppy's behavior sparked a sense of curiosity in Thomas, but it was coupled with a growing concern. Why was this little creature so desperate, and why did it want him to follow? He took a step forward, and the puppy barked once more before dashing down the street, its small legs moving quickly. Thomas's pulse quickened as he broke into a jog to keep up, his breath puffing out in white clouds in the cold air. The streetlights cast long, eerie shadows as he ran, their glow flickering slightly and adding to the unsettling feeling in the pit of his stomach. The puppy paused every few yards, looking back to make sure Thomas was following before running ahead again. They passed darkened houses with manicured lawns and trimmed hedges, their silence amplifying the puppy's cries and the sound of Thomas's footsteps on the pavement. The further they went, the quieter the neighborhood became, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Thomas couldn't shake the strange feeling that settled over him. The puppy led him to the end of the block, where an old park lay shrouded in darkness. The lampposts here were few and far between, their light dimmer than the ones on the main street. The puppy stopped near a patch of overgrown bushes, its tail wagging nervously as it let out a series of short, anxious barks. Thomas slowed his pace, his heartbeat thundering in his chest. He took a moment to catch his breath, eyes fixed on the puppy and the dark shapes behind the bushes. A cold breeze whispered through the park, rustling the leaves and making the scene feel even more surreal. He stepped closer, his shoes crunching on the gravel path, and felt a chill run down his spine. The puppy stood firm, barking urgently and looking up at him with eyes that now seemed almost human in their expression. "What's there, little guy?" Thomas asked, more to himself than to the puppy. He reached down, gently pushing aside some of the branches. His breath caught in his throat as the moonlight illuminated what was hidden behind them, a small bundle, dirty and wrapped in worn blankets. It moved slightly, and a soft whimper came from inside, so faint that Thomas almost thought he had imagined it. The puppy nosed at the bundle, letting out a whine that sounded relieved and anxious at the same time. Thomas's heart stopped for a moment before racing at double speed. He knelt down, carefully peeling back the top layer of the blanket to reveal a tiny face, wide-eyed and shivering. It was a baby, no more than a few months old, with tear-streaked cheeks and eyes that seemed to plead for help. "Oh my God," Thomas whispered, the weight of the situation crashing over him. The puppy sat beside the baby, its small body vibrating with nerves and hope. It looked up at Thomas, almost as if saying, "I did my part, now it's your turn." Thomas's hands shook as he took off his jacket and gently wrapped it around the baby, trying to shield it from the biting cold. The baby's tiny fists clenched as it whimpered again, its eyes fluttering. Thomas's mind raced, struggling to process what was happening. How did this baby end up here? And why had the puppy brought him to it? His fingers fumbled for his phone, barely able to grip it as he dialed 911. The operator's voice sounded distant, almost dreamlike. 911, what's your emergency? Thomas swallowed hard, forcing himself to speak clearly. There's a baby here, left outside in the cold. I need help, now. His voice cracked at the end, and he felt the weight of his words sink in. The puppy, now sitting quietly beside him, glanced up at Thomas with eyes full of trust. It had found him, brought him here, and now waited as if knowing that everything would be all right. The dispatcher's voice snapped him back to the present. Sir, stay on the line. Help is on the way. Thomas looked down at the baby, who was now quieting down, its tiny breaths puffing in the cold air. He placed a protective hand over the bundle, the warmth of his jacket providing a small measure of comfort. The puppy let out one last soft whine and curled up next to the baby, its small body shivering but steadfast. The distant wail of sirens broke through the silence, growing louder with each second. Thomas took a deep breath, feeling the mix of tension and relief wash over him. The baby's eyes closed slowly, and it seemed to relax in the warmth. The puppy, eyes half closed now, stayed close, its job not yet done. Thomas hesitated for only a moment before making a decision that felt more instinctual than rational. He pushed open the front door, stepping into the cool night air. The puppy's sharp barks echoed in the quiet, empty street. The little dog had stopped for a moment at the corner of the fence, glancing back at Thomas with eyes that seemed to plead, "Follow me." It was enough to send a chill down Thomas's spine. "All right, I'm coming," he muttered, jogging after the puppy. The streetlights cast pools of soft yellow light, creating patches of darkness between them that felt deeper in the late hour. Thomas's heartbeat quickened, and he glanced around, noticing how silent the neighborhood seemed, save for the clicking of the puppy's small paws and its persistent barks. As he followed, the puppy darted ahead, pausing every few steps to check that Thomas was still behind. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. Its tiny body shivered, not from cold but from urgency. Thomas noticed how thin the pup was, its ribs pressing against its fur. He couldn't help but wonder how long it had been out here, desperately trying to get someone's attention. The farther they went, the more Thomas's concern deepened. The puppy led him past houses with their lights turned off, their inhabitants blissfully unaware of the strange night unfolding outside. He could hear the faint rustle of leaves and the distant hum of traffic from the main road, but the immediate area was eerily silent. "Where are you taking me, little guy?" Thomas asked under his breath, trying to keep his nerves at bay. The puppy's barking became more frantic as they reached the end of the block. It raced ahead to a spot where the street ended and an overgrown patch of grass and bushes began. Thomas slowed, scanning the darkened area. The streetlight didn't reach this far, and the shadows seemed thicker, more foreboding. The puppy had stopped just short of the thicket, turning to look at Thomas with wide, expectant eyes. It barked again, but this time, the sound was sharp and desperate, almost like a cry for help. Thomas's pulse quickened. He took a cautious step forward, peering into the darkness. The bushes rustled, and Thomas's breath caught in his throat. "Is someone there?" he called out, his voice sounding louder than he intended in the quiet night. The only response was a muffled whimper, soft and fragile. His stomach tightened, and a shiver ran down his spine. He took another step, brushing past the puppy, who now stayed close to his feet, its tail wagging anxiously. With a trembling hand, Thomas reached out and pushed aside a cluster of branches. What he saw made his heart freeze. A small bundle of blankets was tucked into the bushes, barely visible in the low light. The soft whimper came again, and this time, Thomas knew exactly what it was. "Oh my God," he whispered, kneeling down to get a closer look. His hand shook as he pulled back the corner of the blanket to reveal a tiny, round face. A baby, no older than a few weeks, stared up at him with wide, unfocused eyes. The infant's skin was cold, and it let out another weak cry, its little fists opening and closing as if searching for warmth. The puppy nuzzled closer, licking the baby's tiny hand with a gentleness that brought tears to Thomas's eyes. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. How long had the baby been out here? And why had the puppy been the only one to notice, to care enough to seek help? "Hold on, little one," Thomas said, his voice shaking. He quickly took off his jacket and wrapped it around the baby, trying to provide some warmth. The baby's cries quieted slightly, as if sensing that comfort was finally near. Thomas glanced down at the puppy, who sat on its haunches, watching with eyes that were both alert and relieved. Thomas's mind raced as he pieced together the urgency of the situation. This wasn't just a lost puppy, it was a guardian, an unlikely hero that had somehow known exactly what to do. "You're a smart little one, aren't you?" he whispered, reaching down to scratch the puppy's ears briefly before focusing on the baby again. "I need to get help," he muttered, his fingers fumbling for his phone in his pocket. His hands were shaking so much that it took 2 tries to unlock it. He dialed 911, the ringing in his ear seeming to stretch on forever until the dispatcher's calm voice answered, "911, what's your emergency?" "There's a baby," Thomas said, his voice barely steady. He took a deep breath and forced himself to speak clearly. "I found a baby outside, in the bushes near the end of Oak Street. It's cold and there's this puppy that led me here. You need to send help now." The dispatcher's voice remained calm, guiding him through the conversation. "Stay with the baby and keep it warm, sir. We have an ambulance on the way. Can you tell me if the baby is breathing normally?" Thomas nodded, though she couldn't see him. He glanced down at the infant, whose eyes blinked slowly as it shifted in the warmth of his jacket. "Yes, it's breathing, but it's cold and crying softly." "Good. Keep talking to it, keep it calm," the dispatcher said. Thomas swallowed, feeling the weight of the night pressing down on him. He cradled the baby closer, whispering gentle reassurances as he waited. The puppy, as if understanding that its job was done for now, curled up next to Thomas, its eyes never leaving the baby. The quiet determination in the animal's posture was something Thomas couldn't quite understand, but he was grateful for it. In the distance, the faint sound of sirens began to rise, cutting through the silence of the night. Relief flooded Thomas's chest, but he couldn't shake the questions swirling in his mind. Where had the baby come from? Why had it been left here, in the cold, alone? And how had this little puppy been the only one to sound the alarm? He glanced down at the puppy, which looked up at him with eyes that seemed to say, "We did good, didn't we?" Thomas reached down and stroked its head, a small smile breaking through his worry. "You're a hero, you know that?" The puppy's tail wagged, just once, before it settled back into its watchful position. As the sirens grew louder, lights flashed down the street, illuminating the scene in blue and red. Thomas felt a surge of relief wash over him. Help was finally here. He whispered softly to the baby, "You're safe now. We're going to make sure you're okay." The puppy let out a soft bark as if in agreement, its small body vibrating with quiet energy. Thomas took a deep breath, looking up as the ambulance turned the corner, its lights casting long shadows on the pavement. The night wasn't over, but the worst was behind them. For now, they had done everything they could. Thomas crouched down, his breath caught in his throat as he pushed the overgrown branches aside. The moonlight struggled to penetrate the thick foliage, casting a dim glow over the hidden space. His fingers trembled slightly, a mix of fear and urgency propelling him forward. The puppy stood beside him, its eyes wide and tail still, as if it too understood the gravity of the moment. A soft sound, a whimper, almost imperceptible, drifted up from the pile of blankets nestled in the leaves. Thomas's eyes widened as he leaned in closer, gently pulling back the top layer. What he saw made his heart lurch with shock. Wrapped tightly in the makeshift cocoon was a tiny baby, eyes barely open, its face flushed from the chill. The baby's fingers curled weakly as it shivered, its small mouth opening to let out another faint cry. "Oh my God," Thomas breathed, barely registering the cold night air biting at his skin. His mind raced as he looked from the baby to the puppy, which now sat perfectly still, eyes locked on the fragile bundle as if watching over it. "How long have you been out here?" Thomas whispered, his voice breaking as the weight of the situation sank in. He reached out, his hand shaking, to touch the baby's cheek. It was cold, far too cold for comfort. Thomas's instincts roared to life, urging him to act quickly. He shrugged off his jacket, carefully wrapping it around the baby to shield it from the frigid air. The small form nestled into the warmth, letting out a softer, almost relieved whimper. The puppy leaned forward, pressing its tiny nose against the bundle as if to reassure the baby. Thomas looked at the puppy, a surge of respect and awe filling his chest. "You knew," he said, his voice cracking. "You knew this baby needed help." The wind rustled the leaves around them, a stark reminder that they were exposed, alone on a dark, quiet street. Thomas took a deep breath, trying to steady the rush of panic threatening to take over. He fumbled for his phone, his fingers slipping as he dialed. The number felt heavy under his touch, 911. The line clicked, and a dispatcher's calm voice came through. 911, what is your emergency? Thomas swallowed hard, his eyes never leaving the tiny, shivering form in his arms. "I need help," he said, his voice shaking. "I found a baby, alone outside. It's cold," and he glanced at the puppy, still vigilant at his side. "There's a puppy too. It led me here." The dispatcher's tone shifted, more urgent now. "Sir, where are you located?" He rattled off his address, his heart pounding so loudly it felt like it might burst. "Please hurry," he added, a note of desperation in his voice. "The baby is freezing." "Stay calm, sir," the dispatcher reassured him. "An ambulance and police are on the way. Keep the baby warm and stay on the line." Thomas cradled the baby closer, feeling its tiny chest rise and fall against his own. It was so small, so fragile, and the idea of it being out here alone made his stomach twist. "It's okay," he whispered, more to himself than to the baby. "Help is coming." The puppy, sensing the tension, let out a soft whine and nestled against Thomas's leg, as if lending its own comfort. Thomas glanced down, eyes softening despite the chaos around him. "You did good, little one," he said, reaching down to stroke its head. The puppy's eyes met his, unwavering and full of something almost human, understanding. Seconds felt like hours as Thomas waited, every sound amplified by his heightened senses. The faint noise of sirens reached his ears, growing louder, and a rush of relief flooded him. "They're coming," he murmured to the baby, who shifted slightly, letting out a soft sigh. The street, which had seemed so ominous and lonely just moments before, began to fill with the flashing lights of emergency vehicles. An ambulance screeched to a stop at the curb, and paramedics leapt out, their faces serious and focused. "Over here," Thomas called, lifting the bundle slightly to show them. A paramedic, a young woman with kind eyes and quick hands, knelt beside him. "It's going to be okay," she said, her voice calm but urgent as she carefully took the baby from his arms. She wrapped it in a thermal blanket and checked its vitals, nodding to her partner. "We need to get this baby warm and stable," she said. Thomas stood back, his legs weak with the adrenaline that coursed through him. The puppy moved forward, watching as the paramedics worked. One of them paused, glancing at the small dog with a puzzled expression. "Did this puppy lead you here?" she asked, a note of disbelief in her voice. Thomas nodded, emotion tightening his throat. "Yes, it wouldn't stop crying until I followed it. I wouldn't have found the baby without it." The paramedic's eyes softened as she looked at the puppy. "Looks like we have more than one hero tonight," she said with a small smile. As the paramedics carried the baby to the ambulance, Thomas felt a sense of emptiness where the weight of the child had been. He looked down at the puppy, whose eyes followed the ambulance with an intensity that suggested it understood exactly what was happening. The officer who had arrived with the paramedics stepped forward, taking Thomas's statement. "You did a brave thing tonight," the officer said, scribbling notes on his pad. "Not many would have thought to follow a stray like that." Thomas shrugged, still trying to process everything. "I couldn't ignore it," he admitted. "There was something in the way it cried. It just knew." The puppy barked softly, as if agreeing, before turning to Thomas with expectant eyes. "Looks like you have a new friend," the officer said with a chuckle, nodding toward the dog. Thomas felt a strange warmth in his chest as he knelt to pet the puppy, its small body trembling from excitement and exhaustion. "Yeah," he said softly, "I guess I do." As the ambulance doors closed and the vehicle pulled away, Thomas watched until it disappeared down the road, the sirens fading into the distance. The puppy nuzzled against him, and he stood up, picking it up in his arms. For the first time that night, he allowed himself a moment to breathe, the realization sinking in, they had saved a life together. The street, now lit with the subtle glow of dawn breaking on the horizon, felt different, warmer, safer. And in that moment, Thomas knew that he and this small, brave puppy had been part of something bigger than either of them. They had given hope where there was none, and as he carried the puppy back to his house, he knew that this night was just the beginning of a new chapter, one where compassion and courage could change everything. Thomas's hands shook as he gripped his phone, dialing 911. His voice cracked as he spoke to the dispatcher, each word spilling out in a rush. "There's a baby," he said, glancing down at the tiny, shivering infant bundled in dirty blankets. "I just found her outside, in the cold." He took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing heart. The puppy sat next to him, its eyes wide and watchful, as if waiting for confirmation that everything would be okay. "Sir, please stay calm," the dispatcher said, her voice professional yet soothing. "Can you tell me your location and the condition of the child?" Thomas rattled off his address and looked down at the baby, whose tiny fists were clenched, her face pale but breathing. "She's cold, and she looks scared, but she's alive," he said, relief and worry mixing in his tone. "Help is on the way, sir," the dispatcher reassured him. "Stay with the baby, keep her warm, and make sure she is safe." Thomas nodded, realizing that even though the dispatcher couldn't see him, she needed to know he understood. He quickly took off his jacket, wrapping it gently around the baby's small frame. The puppy nudged his arm with its nose, letting out a soft whine as if urging him to hurry. "It's okay," Thomas whispered to the puppy, glancing at it with gratitude. "You did great." The puppy's tail wagged slightly, but its eyes remained fixed on the baby. It was as if this tiny creature understood the gravity of the situation better than anyone. The sound of distant sirens reached Thomas's ears, and for the first time that night, he felt a flicker of hope. The minutes stretched out, feeling like hours. Thomas kept his eyes on the road, straining to catch the first sign of flashing lights. The night air was crisp and cold, biting at his exposed arms, but he barely noticed. His focus was entirely on the child in his arms, whose breathing was shallow but steady. The puppy sat close, its body a small source of warmth against his leg. "Hang in there, little one," Thomas murmured, rocking the baby gently. The memory of finding her nestled in the bushes replayed in his mind. Who could have left her out here? And why? Questions buzzed around his head, but there was no time for answers now. The most important thing was keeping her safe until help arrived. Finally, the blare of the sirens grew louder, and a flash of red and blue lights illuminated the street. An ambulance pulled up to the curb, its wheels skidding slightly on the damp pavement. 2 paramedics jumped out, moving swiftly toward him. "Over here," Thomas called, his voice hoarse with relief. The first paramedic, a woman with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor, knelt beside him. Her hands were quick but gentle as she took the baby from his arms, checking her vital signs. "You found her like this?" she asked, her eyes flicking to Thomas before focusing back on the child. "Yes," Thomas said, his voice trembling. "She was just lying there, in the bushes. This puppy, it led me to her." He gestured to the small dog that now sat quietly, its head cocked as it watched the scene unfold. The paramedic glanced at the puppy, a hint of surprise crossing her face. "Well, it looks like we have a hero on our hands," she said with a faint smile before turning her attention back to the baby. The second paramedic, a young man with dark hair and a focused expression, stood beside Thomas and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You did good," he said. "Finding her when you did probably saved her life." Thomas felt a lump rise in his throat, and he nodded, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. As the paramedics worked, wrapping the baby in a thermal blanket and checking her pulse, the puppy let out a small, hopeful bark. The female paramedic looked over her shoulder and laughed softly, a sound that cut through the tension. "You really are something, aren't you?" she said to the puppy, giving it a gentle pat. Thomas stood up, feeling his legs shake with adrenaline. He hadn't realized how tense he was until now. The ambulance door swung open, and the paramedics gently placed the baby on a stretcher. "We need to get her to the hospital to make sure she's okay," the young man said. He looked at Thomas, a question in his eyes. "Do you want to come with us?" Thomas glanced at the puppy, which wagged its tail as if urging him forward. He nodded quickly. "Yes, I'll come." He reached down, picking up the puppy and holding it close to his chest. It snuggled into him, a soft warmth against the chill of the night. As he climbed into the ambulance, the sirens blared to life, and they sped off toward the hospital. The streetlights flickered by in a blur, casting long, moving shadows inside the vehicle. Thomas watched the paramedics work with practiced efficiency, their hands moving swiftly as they monitored the baby's breathing and heart rate. "Her temperature is low, but she's stable," the female paramedic said, glancing at Thomas. "You really did save her life tonight." Thomas swallowed hard, feeling a rush of emotions he couldn't quite name. He looked down at the puppy in his arms, its eyes wide and alert, and whispered, "We did." The hospital loomed ahead, its bright lights cutting through the darkness. The ambulance pulled into the emergency bay, and Thomas felt a sense of urgency wash over him as the doors opened. The paramedics rushed the baby inside, and Thomas followed, the puppy cradled tightly in his arms. Inside, the sterile smell of antiseptic and the hum of medical equipment filled the air. Nurses and doctors moved quickly, taking the baby from the paramedics and into a room where she could be checked thoroughly. Thomas stood in the hallway, feeling a mix of helplessness and hope. The puppy, sensing his unease, licked his hand gently, grounding him. A nurse approached, her expression kind but serious. "You did a good thing tonight," she said. "The baby's condition is stable, and we'll do everything we can to make sure she's okay." Thomas nodded, relief washing over him like a wave. He looked at the puppy, whose tail wagged slightly, as if it understood every word. As he sat in a chair, waiting for any update, Thomas reflected on the events that had brought him here. The cries in the night, the puppy's insistent barking, the discovery of the baby, it all felt surreal. The questions that had swirled in his mind earlier returned. Who was the baby? And why had she been left out there alone? The hallway bustled with activity, but Thomas's focus remained on the closed door of the room where the baby was being treated. He stroked the puppy's fur absent-mindedly, finding comfort in its steady presence. A doctor stepped out moments later, looking around before spotting Thomas. She's stable, the doctor said, offering a small, reassuring smile. It's a good thing you found her when you did. Thomas let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Can I see her? He asked, hope flickering in his voice. The doctor nodded. Just for a moment. We need to keep her monitored, but she's doing well. Thomas stood, the puppy still cradled in his arms, and followed the doctor into the room. There, under the soft glow of the hospital lights, the baby lay on a small bed, wrapped securely in a warm blanket. Her tiny chest rose and fell with each breath, and Thomas felt his heart swell with emotion. The puppy's ears perked up as it looked at the baby, letting out a soft whimper, as if relieved to see her safe. You're going to be okay, little one, Thomas whispered, a smile breaking through the tension on his face. The puppy licked his hand again, its eyes full of trust. This little dog had led him to a miracle, and now, as he stood there, he knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter filled with questions, hope, and second chances. The flashing red and blue lights cast an eerie glow across the dark street, bouncing off windows and illuminating the anxious faces of onlookers. The low wail of the ambulance siren cut through the night as it came to a halt in front of Thomas's house. The puppy, still sitting protectively by the tiny bundle of blankets, let out a soft whine as the paramedics jumped out, their movements quick and practiced. Over here! Thomas called out, his voice urgent as he waved the paramedics over. One of them, a woman with short, cropped hair and a calm, focused expression, rushed to Thomas's side, her eyes widening when she saw the tiny baby shivering under the blanket. It's a baby, she said, her voice tinged with surprise and concern. She reached down gently, her hand steady as she scooped up the infant. The crowd that had gathered nearby murmured, their whispers blending into a low hum. Is the baby okay? Someone asked, craning their neck to get a better view. Thomas stood back, his heart pounding as he watched the paramedic check the baby's vitals, her practiced hands moving swiftly and surely. It's cold but breathing, the paramedic said, wrapping the baby in a thermal blanket she had brought with her. Her partner, a tall man with a kind face, joined her, glancing at Thomas. How did you find her? He asked, his tone laced with curiosity and disbelief. Thomas glanced down at the puppy, which had moved to sit by his feet, its eyes still trained on the baby with unwavering focus. This little guy led me here, Thomas said, motioning to the dog. He wouldn't stop crying at my door until I followed him. The paramedic paused, her expression softening as she looked at the small dog. A guardian angel in disguise, she said, half smiling before turning her attention back to the baby. The puppy wagged its tail slightly, as if understanding that its efforts were being acknowledged. Just then, the sound of tires skidding caught Thomas's attention. A police car pulled up, and two officers stepped out, their eyes darting around to take in the scene. One of the officers, Officer Reed, a man with a serious face and sharp eyes, approached Thomas. What's going on here? He asked, glancing between Thomas, the paramedics, and the baby. Thomas took a breath to steady himself. I found this baby outside, hidden in the bushes, he explained, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside him. The puppy led me to her. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. He gestured to the small dog, which looked up at Officer Reed with its wide, innocent eyes. Reed's expression softened for just a moment before returning to its usual stern demeanor. Do you know where the baby's parents are? He asked, shifting his focus to the paramedics. They both shook their heads as they continued their examination. No, but we're going to take the baby to the hospital to make sure she's okay, the paramedic with the kind face said. She needs to be checked for any signs of exposure or other issues. The officer nodded, his brow furrowing as he took notes. We'll need to investigate further, he said, turning back to Thomas. Thank you for acting so quickly. This could have ended much worse. Thomas nodded, a wave of relief washing over him. He felt the tension in his shoulders ease slightly, but the worry for the tiny life in front of him still lingered. The puppy, sensing the shift in mood, moved closer to Thomas and let out a small bark, as if trying to say, keep going. It's not over yet. The other officer, a younger woman with curly hair tucked under her cap, crouched down to pet the puppy. "Good job, buddy," she whispered, her smile soft and genuine. The puppy's tail wagged faster, eyes bright with a mix of excitement and concern. The paramedics gently placed the baby in a portable incubator and began to wheel her toward the ambulance. The crowd stepped back, giving them space but still watching intently. "Is she going to be all right?" an elderly woman called out, her voice trembling with concern. "We're going to do everything we can," the paramedic assured, nodding before climbing into the back of the ambulance. The doors shut with a final click, and the vehicle's engine roared to life, pulling away with its lights still flashing. Thomas stood on the curb, watching the ambulance disappear down the street. The weight of the moment pressed heavily on him. He looked down at the puppy, which was now sitting quietly, its job seemingly done. "You did something incredible tonight," he said softly, bending down to scratch behind the dog's ears. The puppy leaned into his touch, its eyes closing momentarily as if savoring the brief moment of peace. Officer Reed stepped forward again, his notepad tucked away. "We're going to canvass the neighborhood and see if anyone knows anything," he said. "Do you mind if we speak to you again later if we find out more?" "Of course," Thomas replied, still keeping one hand on the puppy. "I'll do whatever I can to help." The younger officer stood up, her eyes kind as she looked at Thomas. "It's not every day that we see this kind of heroism from a man and a stray dog," she said with a small smile. "Thank you." Thomas nodded, a warm feeling spreading in his chest. The puppy let out a soft whine and nuzzled against his leg, as if to say, "What now?" The crowd began to disperse, the initial excitement giving way to the cold reality of the night. But Thomas stayed put for a moment longer, looking down at the small hero that had changed everything in an instant. "Come on," he said, standing up. "Let's get you inside. You deserve a good meal." The puppy's tail wagged, and it trotted beside Thomas as they walked back to the house. He opened the door, the warm light spilling out onto the porch and illuminating the puppy's tired but hopeful eyes. "Tonight, you're not just a stray," Thomas said, a smile breaking through the seriousness of the evening. "Tonight, you're a hero." The puppy yipped happily, trotting inside as if it had always belonged there. Thomas closed the door behind them, taking one last look at the quiet street before locking it. He knew that this was only the beginning of a story that had yet to unfold. The night air was still heavy with the tension of the unfolding scene as Thomas watched the paramedics work carefully around the baby. The puppy sat close by, its small body vibrating with energy as if it understood the importance of the moment. One paramedic, a young woman with kind eyes, glanced up from her task and caught sight of the puppy. "Did this dog really find the baby?" she asked, disbelief and amazement mingling in her voice. Thomas nodded, still struggling to process everything that had happened. "Yes, it did. It wouldn't stop crying at my door until I came out and followed it." He reached down to give the puppy a gentle pat on the head, feeling a surge of admiration for the small creature. The puppy's eyes stayed on the baby, its tail wagging just enough to show its relief. The paramedic exchanged glances with her partner, a burly man with a serious expression softened by the unexpected heroism of the puppy. "Looks like we've got a hero on our hands," he said, a hint of a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. As the paramedics wrapped the baby in a warm, thermal blanket, the officer who had arrived with them stepped forward. He wore a navy blue uniform that seemed to absorb the dim glow of the streetlights. "Sir, can I get your statement?" he asked Thomas, notebook and pen ready. Thomas took a deep breath, still feeling the weight of the night pressing on him. "It was around midnight when I first heard the puppy crying outside. At first, I thought it was just a stray looking for food or shelter, but it wouldn't stop," he explained, gesturing toward the little dog now sitting patiently. "When I stepped outside, it ran and kept looking back at me, like it was leading me somewhere." The officer nodded, jotting down every detail. "And then it led you to the baby?" he prompted, his pen pausing mid-note. "Yes," Thomas said, glancing down at the puppy, which seemed to be listening to every word. "It brought me to the bushes over there," he pointed to the patch of overgrown greenery at the end of the block. "That's where I found the baby." The officer's eyes softened as he looked at the tiny bundle in the paramedic's arms. It's a miracle the baby was found in time, he said, more to himself than to Thomas. The baby let out a tiny cry, and the paramedic shushed it gently, her expression full of tenderness. You're safe now, little one, she whispered. Thomas felt his chest tighten at the sight. He turned back to the officer, who continued taking notes. Is there any sign of the parents? The officer asked, his brow furrowed with concern. Thomas shook his head. No, not that I could see, he replied, glancing around the street, which seemed eerily quiet now that the immediate chaos had settled. But this little one, he said, nodding at the puppy, seems to know more than it's letting on. The officer looked at the puppy with newfound respect. Well, if there was ever a time to call a dog a hero, this is it, he said, a hint of a smile breaking through his otherwise serious demeanor. We'll need to search the area and see if we can find any clues about who might have left the baby here. Just then, the puppy barked sharply, its attention drawn down the street. Thomas's heart skipped a beat as he followed its gaze to a darkened alleyway a few houses down. The officer noticed a change in the puppy's behavior and straightened, his eyes narrowing as he peered into the shadows. Is there someone there? He asked, his hand instinctively moving to the flashlight on his belt. The puppy barked again, more insistent this time, and took a few tentative steps forward. The officer exchanged a quick glance with Thomas, then nodded. Stay here, he instructed, turning on his flashlight and moving cautiously toward the alley. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating bits of litter and the rough outlines of brick walls. Thomas held his breath, the night air suddenly feeling colder. The puppy stood at his feet, eyes fixed on the officer's movements. The street seemed to hold its breath along with them, silence stretching thin as they waited for something, anything, to happen. The light from the officer's flashlight swept across the alley and stopped when it caught movement. A figure shifted against the wall, hunched and shivering. Hey, can you hear me? The officer called out, his voice firm but not unkind. The figure didn't respond at first, just curled tighter as if trying to disappear into the shadows. Thomas's curiosity overcame his hesitation, and he took a step forward, the puppy following. The officer glanced back, his expression stern. Stay back, sir, he said, but his eyes softened when he saw the worry on Thomas's face. The figure moved again, this time lifting a head covered in a worn hood. A pair of wide, tear-streaked eyes looked up, filled with both fear and recognition. The puppy barked again, the sound sharp and full of urgency. It pulled against Thomas's gentle hold as if wanting to go to the person in the alley. The officer's light revealed more details, the tattered coat, the thin arms wrapped tightly around a frail body. It was a young woman, barely more than a teenager. She glanced between the officer, Thomas, and the puppy, her expression one of exhausted relief and desperation. You found her, she whispered, her voice cracking as tears rolled down her cheeks. Thomas's heart thudded in his chest as he realized what she meant. Is she the mother? He asked, looking at the officer, who nodded solemnly. The young woman's gaze shifted to the ambulance where the baby was being cared for. Her shoulders trembled, and she struggled to stand, nearly collapsing from weakness. The officer stepped forward, offering her a steadying arm. It's okay, he said softly. Your baby is safe. But we need to know what happened. Tears spilled from her eyes as she leaned against the wall, her voice barely above a whisper. I couldn't keep her warm. I didn't know what else to do, she confessed, eyes locked on the puppy. He stayed with her, made sure she wasn't alone. Thomas felt a lump in his throat as he looked down at the small, scruffy dog that had made everything possible. The officer's expression softened, understanding the gravity of the situation. We'll get you both to the hospital, he said, signaling for the paramedics. The young woman's legs buckled, but the officer caught her, helping her walk toward the ambulance. The puppy trotted alongside, its job far from done. One of the paramedics opened the door and carefully guided the mother and the puppy inside, where the baby was waiting, bundled and safe. Thomas watched as the ambulance doors closed, a mix of relief and sadness in his heart. The officer turned to him, gratitude in his eyes. Thank you for acting quickly, he said. You might have saved more than one life tonight. Thomas nodded, unable to find the right words as the ambulance's siren wailed, carrying the trio toward safety and a new beginning. He looked down at the now empty street and then at the puppy, who had already turned back to Thomas with a wagging tail. You really are something, aren't you? Thomas said, picking up the little hero. The puppy licked his face, and Thomas smiled, knowing that life had just changed in a way he would never forget. Thomas's heart raced as he squinted into the darkness where the puppy's gaze was fixed. The officer, already on high alert, took a cautious step toward the alley, his flashlight slicing through the dim light. The beam illuminated a shadow shifting against the wall, and Thomas felt a surge of curiosity and worry. He held his breath as the officer moved closer, calling out, "Is someone there?" The puppy let out a low whine, its tail wagging nervously as it took a few hesitant steps forward. Thomas could see the tiny animal's dedication. It wasn't going to leave until the mystery was solved. The officer turned back to give a quick nod to Thomas, signaling that he should stay put. But Thomas's eyes were glued to the scene, unable to look away. As the flashlight beam steadied, it landed on a hunched figure leaning against the brick wall. It was a young woman with disheveled hair and a coat that was too thin for the chilly night. She flinched as the light fell on her face, squinting and raising an arm to shield her eyes. "Please, don't hurt me," she whispered, her voice weak and strained. The officer's stance softened, and he approached more slowly. "Ma'am, are you okay?" he asked, his voice steady but compassionate. The woman's eyes flicked from the officer to the puppy, recognition lighting up her weary face. Tears welled up as she dropped her arm and took a shaky step forward. "The baby," she said, her voice breaking. Did you find her?" Thomas's heart thudded loudly in his chest as he realized who she was. This was the baby's mother. The officer glanced back at Thomas and nodded for him to come closer. Thomas hesitated for only a moment before crossing the street to where the woman stood, her whole body trembling from exhaustion and worry. "Yes, we found her," Thomas said softly, taking in the relief that washed over the young woman's face. Her knees buckled, and she would have fallen if the officer hadn't reached out to steady her. She sank to the ground, hands covering her face as sobs racked her body. The puppy immediately rushed to her side, licking her hands and whimpering in sympathy. The crowd that had gathered earlier began to move in closer, their whispers growing louder. "Is that the baby's mother?" someone asked. "What happened?" another voice chimed in. The officer turned to the onlookers, raising a hand to keep them at a distance. "Please, give her space," he said firmly. Thomas knelt beside the woman, his voice gentle. "She's safe. The paramedics are taking care of her right now. You did the right thing trying to keep her safe." The woman's hands fell away from her face, revealing tear-streaked cheeks and eyes filled with gratitude and pain. "I tried," she whispered. "I couldn't keep her warm, and I was so scared. I didn't know where else to go." The officer nodded, his expression softening as he spoke. "We'll get you both the help you need. You're not alone anymore." He glanced at the puppy, which had sat down beside the woman, its eyes wide and alert. "And this little guy deserves credit for leading us here." The young woman's eyes moved to the puppy, and a small, trembling smile appeared on her face. "You saved her," she said, reaching out to scratch behind its ears. The puppy leaned into her touch, its tail wagging gently as if it understood. The sound of approaching footsteps drew their attention back toward the street. Another police car had arrived, and officers stepped out, their faces a mix of concern and determination. One of them, a tall woman with a badge glinting in the streetlight, approached and knelt beside the young mother. "We're here to help," she said. "Can you tell us your name?" The woman's voice was barely a whisper. "Amina," she said, looking up with tearful eyes. The officer nodded. "Amina, we're going to take you and your baby to the hospital to make sure you're both okay. After that, we'll make sure you get the support you need." Thomas felt a wave of relief wash over him. The situation had started with a mysterious puppy's cries and ended with a rescue that would stay with him forever. He watched as Amina, still holding the puppy, was gently helped up by the officers. The crowd murmured in approval, some even clapping softly as the reality of the moment set in. This was more than just a rescue, it was a reminder of the power of compassion and determination. The paramedics approached with the baby, now bundled warmly in blankets. Amina's face lit up with a mix of joy and disbelief as they placed her child in her arms. She hugged the baby close, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered, looking at Thomas, the officers, and finally the puppy that had never left her side. One of the officers turned to Thomas with a nod of gratitude. "If it wasn't for you following that pup, who knows how this could have ended?" Thomas smiled, feeling an unexpected warmth in his chest. "It wasn't just me," he said, glancing down at the little dog. "This pup was determined to make sure someone listened." The puppy, now the center of everyone's attention, barked happily, its mission accomplished. Thomas reached down and scooped it up, feeling its small, warm body wriggle in his arms. "Looks like you've earned yourself a place to stay, little hero," he said, and the puppy licked his cheek in response. Amina looked at Thomas and the puppy, her eyes full of gratitude. "Thank you for not ignoring him," she said, her voice breaking. "I owe you everything." "No," Thomas replied softly. "We owe it to this pup. He's the real hero here." As the ambulance doors closed and Amina and her baby were taken to the hospital, Thomas stood on the quiet street with the puppy in his arms. The officers began dispersing the crowd, but not before a few people came up to shake Thomas's hand and pet the little dog that had saved a life. The street was quieter now, but the weight of what had just happened lingered. Thomas looked up at the sky, where the first hints of dawn were breaking through. The night had been long and full of surprises, but as he felt the puppy's steady heartbeat against him, he knew that this was a story that would stay with him forever. He glanced down at the puppy, who now seemed content and sleepy. "I think we'll make a great team," Thomas said, walking back toward his house. The puppy gave a small yawn, as if agreeing, and nestled closer to him. In that moment, Thomas realized that life sometimes brought unexpected challenges, but it also brought moments of profound connection. And tonight, a small, determined puppy had shown him just how powerful those moments could be. The officer guided the young woman toward the ambulance as she stumbled, exhaustion evident in every movement. Thomas stepped aside, his eyes never leaving the woman as she approached the open doors of the vehicle. Her eyes were wide with a mixture of hope and fear, darting from the paramedics to the baby bundled safely inside. "She's safe," one of the paramedics said gently, meeting the mother's eyes with a soft smile. The woman's breath hitched as she looked at her child, relief flooding her features. Tears spilled down her cheeks, tracing clean lines through the dirt on her face. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. Her hand trembled as she reached out to touch the baby's tiny hand. I thought I'd lost her," the woman whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. The puppy, sitting dutifully by her feet, let out a small whimper, as if sensing her turmoil. She glanced down, and a smile tugged at the corner of her lips. "You found her," she said softly, bending down to stroke the puppy's fur with gratitude. The puppy's tail wagged, its mission seemingly complete. Thomas felt a lump form in his throat as he watched the scene unfold. He'd never witnessed something so raw and heart-wrenching. "You did everything you could to keep her safe," he said, stepping forward and meeting the mother's eyes. She looked at him, surprise and relief crossing her face as she recognized him as the man who had helped. "I didn't know what else to do," she admitted, a sob breaking free as she wrapped her arms around herself. "It was so cold, and I didn't have anywhere to go. I couldn't keep her warm. I was so afraid." The officer, who had been standing by, put a gentle hand on her shoulder. "It's all right now," he said, his tone soft but firm. "We'll get you both the help you need." The woman nodded, tears still streaming down her face, but a spark of hope had returned to her eyes. The paramedics carefully lifted the baby from the ambulance, placing her in her mother's arms. The woman cradled her daughter close, her body trembling as she held the child to her chest. The puppy pressed against her leg, its small body warm and reassuring. She glanced down at the dog again, her eyes full of gratitude and amazement. "You're a hero," she whispered. Thomas felt a surge of warmth wash over him. This stray puppy, once just a tiny, forgotten animal, had saved a life and brought hope back to a mother who had been on the brink of despair. He looked at the puppy, its tail wagging with a sense of purpose, and knew that this little one deserved recognition for its bravery. A crowd had begun to gather at the edge of the street, drawn by the flashing lights and the commotion. Whispers moved through the onlookers as they pieced together what had happened. "Is that a baby?" someone asked, their voice filled with awe. "Did that dog save her?" An older woman stepped forward, her eyes wide as she took in the scene. "I saw that puppy wandering the neighborhood all week," she said. "I had no idea it was trying to help someone." Murmurs of amazement and respect rippled through the crowd as they watched the puppy, who now sat with a proud, yet humble, expression. The officer turned to Thomas, a smile playing at the edges of his lips. "Looks like this little guy deserves a medal," he said, nodding toward the puppy. Thomas chuckled, the tension in his chest finally easing. "Or at the very least, a warm home and a lot of love," he said, scratching the puppy behind the ears. The dog leaned into his touch, its eyes closing for a moment of contentment. The young mother's eyes met Thomas's again, and she took a shaky breath. "Thank you," she said, her voice full of emotion. "You didn't have to help, but you did. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't." Thomas's heart swelled with compassion. "I'm just glad I heard him," he said, nodding at the puppy. "He's the real hero here." The paramedics finished checking the baby and mother, giving a nod of reassurance. "They're both going to be fine," one of them said. "We'll take them to the hospital to get warmed up and checked over, but they're safe now." The officer gestured to one of his colleagues. "Let's make sure she has somewhere to stay and support moving forward," he said. The colleague nodded, stepping aside to make a call. As the ambulance prepared to leave, the young mother glanced back at Thomas and the puppy. "Will you keep him?" she asked, her eyes filled with hope. "He deserves a good home." Thomas looked down at the small dog, who was now watching him intently, its tail wagging in slow, happy arcs. He smiled and nodded. "Yes, I will. He's already a part of this story, and I think he belongs with me now." The puppy let out a small, joyful bark, and the crowd broke into applause, touched by the unlikely hero's bravery and the kindness that had brought them all together. The ambulance doors closed, and the siren wailed softly as it pulled away, carrying the mother and her baby to safety. As the crowd began to disperse, Thomas knelt beside the puppy. "Well, little guy, it looks like you found your home," he said. The puppy licked his face, a clear sign of approval. Neighbors approached, congratulating Thomas and marveling at the puppy's courage. "That's one special dog you've got there," an older man said, patting the puppy's head. Thomas nodded, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. "Yes, he is. He's a reminder that even the smallest among us can do great things." The street slowly returned to its peaceful state as people went back to their homes, talking about the remarkable events of the evening. The puppy, now curled up in Thomas's arms, let out a content sigh as Thomas carried him inside. The warmth of the house enveloped them, a stark contrast to the cold night they had just left behind. Thomas set the puppy down on a soft blanket by the fire, watching as it curled into a ball and looked up at him with trusting eyes. He reached down, scratching the little dog behind the ears. "You did good today," he whispered. "You really did." As the flames crackled and cast a warm glow over the room, Thomas sat down beside his new companion. The events of the night replayed in his mind, the cries, the chase, the discovery. It had all led to this moment, a moment of peace after the storm. The puppy yawned and rested its head on Thomas's leg, and for the first time that night, Thomas felt the tension in his chest dissolve completely. Outside, the stars twinkled brightly, as if to celebrate the heroics of a stray puppy that had brought hope and new beginnings to an otherwise ordinary night. And inside, Thomas knew that life, with its unexpected twists and turns, had just given him a gift he would cherish forever. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell.